Sean Diddy Combs was convicted on 2 federal charges, each carrying up to 10 years in prison. But now, in a twist maybe no one saw coming, reports say President Donald Trump's team has been in talks with Diddy's lawyers about a possible presidential pardon. Could Trump really set Diddy free?
There's a moment when a locked door opens and the sound it makes isn't freedom, it's disbelief. Because when something is supposed to last longer, when pressure is supposed to keep building, an ending doesn't feel like relief. It feels like a glitch.
Testimony and a verdict that ended in Sean Diddy Combs' conviction on 2 federal sex crimes charges. Could he be pardoned by the President of the United States? You know, that is a question that came up a lot when we were doing the live streams of the Diddy trial every day on YouTube. I never really considered it as a real possibility, but I'll tell you what, now, based on current reporting, we may have to take this seriously. Oh, and in terms of relief for Diddy, we also have to get into his defense team's new memo that they filed arguing that his conviction should be thrown out, or at the very least, he should get a new trial. We're going to talk about that too. And by the way, let me tell you, we have an amazing guest who I'm going to be bringing on in a little bit, somebody who actually helped secure federal pardons for his clients, including from President Trump, and is an expert in criminal law, has been following this case from the very beginning. I'm going to bring him on in a little bit. But why do I say that we have to take pardons seriously now? Why? Well, TMZ has reported that President Donald Trump's administration has been talking to Diddy's legal team about a potential pardon, a forgiveness for a federal crime. It's enshrined in the Constitution. Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1, the president shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. And according to TMZ, his decision to pardon Diddy may be determined based on if Judge Arun Subramanian grants Diddy bail, which, by the way, we dedicated a whole sidebar to the other day. His team just filed a brand new letter with the court asking for him to be released. I broke it down, discussed all those arguments. But TMZ also has reported that the pardon decision could also come down to how Diddy is ultimately sentenced on October 3rd. And remember, he was acquitted of racketeering and sex trafficking, but he was found guilty of the 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution, the Mann Act violations, namely transporting his exes, Jane and Cassie Ventura Fine, and men across state lines for the purposes of sex work. Each charge carries up to 10 years in prison, although I'll tell you, in a prior filing, the government was looking at roughly 4 to 5 year prison sentence. Mind you, this is before a pre-sentencing report has been prepared for the court, which does a full background check and analysis of Diddy's life and crimes. Now, the defense would definitely love time served and he gets out, or 21 to 27 months. And remember, at the time of sentencing, he'll have been locked up for a full year, so he'll get credit for that. And the judge has discretion here because there's no mandatory minimum when I would certainly look at the facts. If I think somebody was mistreated, whether they like me or don't like me, it wouldn't have any impact on me. He used to really like me a lot, but I think when I ran for politics, that relationship busted up from what I read. I don't know, he didn't tell me that, but I'd read some little bit nasty statements in the paper all of a sudden. And Diddy had been photographed with Trump over the years. There was some sort of relationship there. President Trump even called him a good friend on a 2012 episode of his TV show The Apprentice. The problem is, some comments Diddy made about Trump in recent years as Diddy really entered the political realm. There's a video where he's speaking to radio host Charlemagne saying, if Trump gets elected, I really do believe in my heart there'll be a race war. In another video on Revolt, he says white men like Trump need to be banished. And by the way, you know who's not letting anyone forget this? Combs' rival 50 Cent. Took to social media recently, wrote, see, Trump don't like S like this, buddy. You run your mouth too much. And Donald doesn't take well to disrespect and doesn't forget who chooses to go against him. While working tirelessly to make America great again, there is no room for distraction. He would consider pardoning anyone who was being mistreated, not Puff Daddy. And let me tell you, the idea of Trump pardoning Diddy is not getting a ton of love out there. Conservative commentator Megyn Kelly posted on X, Trump should not pardon Diddy. He doesn't deserve it. He's a Trump hater. He's a woman abuser. MAGA is already upset over elites seeming to cover for each other. This would not help. GOP struggling with young female voters, most of whom will hate a Diddy pardon. And then you just had...
That's where this story begins. Not with celebration, not with clarity, but with confusion. The kind that spreads when a system reverses course faster than anyone expected. One day, the narrative is permanence, consequences, containment. The next day, it's exit procedures and quiet paperwork. And no one is prepared for how fast that switch happens. Behind walls like these, time is weaponized, days are meant to stretch, weeks are meant to blur. The environment is designed to break rhythm, not restore it. So when release comes suddenly, it doesn't feel earned or denied. It feels abrupt. artificial, almost strategic. That's why people don't ask why now out loud, they ask it internally, over and over. Because systems don't change direction without pressure. The official explanation is always clean: legal language, process language, compliance language, everything framed as procedure working exactly as intended. But procedure doesn't move without influence. It doesn't accelerate unless something forces it to. And force doesn't have to be visible.
Other random accounts like America First. What? He's actually considering this? Diddy is a depraved, abusive, sexual deviant who should be spending the rest of his life in prison. If Trump pardons him, he will get absolutely crushed. Who is advising him lately? It's looking like straight up sabotage at this point. There were other accounts that were not in favor of it, although there was this account. Milo posted on X, Trump has no choice but to pardon Diddy after the government, led by James Comey's daughter Maureen, simply lost interest in Diddy's guilt the moment they secured his tapes incriminating powerful Democrats. The prosecution was a shambles. The trial was a farce. Now, I want to talk about if this is really going to happen, how it would happen. Also, if it really depends on bail and sentencing, then what are we talking about? And I have somebody who not only has been following the Diddy case from the very beginning, not only is a renowned criminal defense attorney, but actually has obtained federal pardons from the president, including from Donald Trump. By the way, for his clients Kodak Black and Lil Wayne, those were maybe the most notable. I'm joined by Bradford Cohen. Bradford, thank you so much for coming here on Sidebar. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Jess.
Now, before I even get into the pardon, okay, there was a bit of breaking news before we were going to come on. This is what I want to get your opinion on first. So Combs' defense team filed a memo in support of a motion for judgment of acquittal, or in the alternative, a motion for a new trial. And basically, I know you read through it, but basically the evidence, they would say, is insufficient to sustain that conviction. Their main arguments is really echoing what we've talked about a little bit when it came to the bail analysis, but that his prosecution, his conviction on these Mann Act prostitution charges is so unique. He wasn't profiting off of this business. All consenting adults were involved. The jury didn't find that there was any sex trafficking. They argued this isn't even prostitution per se, it's voyeurism, that the intent wasn't for people to travel for sex for money, but he paid them for their time. Everybody was having a good time. He makes a First Amendment argument that the freak-offs and the hotel nights were performances that were typically videotaped so they could watch them later on. It's just amateur pornography. And then finally makes the argument that he was prejudiced because of all the other evidence that came in to prove RICO or sex trafficking, and would have never came in if he was merely being prosecuted for prostitution, particularly the Intercontinental Hotel footage of him purporting to beat up Cassie Ventura Fine. And he says, at the very least, he needs a new trial. I hand it over to you. You think this is a successful argument?
Thank you. I don't know if it's going to be successful in the judgment of acquittal. I think the argument is interesting because everyone agrees he might be the only person in custody right now that has ever been convicted of the Mann Act. The Mann Act, and it gives a nice history of the Mann Act, and a lot of people don't understand what the Mann Act is, but the Mann Act was enacted because of a racist motivation that white women were being recruited by people of color to go across state lines and make money. So actually pimping those women across state lines and making money off of their sexual exploits. Obviously, that's not the case here. It's used so infrequently, it might have been a handful of people were actually charged with the Mann Act. No one in custody currently has ever been convicted of the Mann Act. So it's an interesting argument to say, hey, listen, this Mann Act, the original reason for it was racist. The original way that it was applied was racist. The way it's applied here is incorrect because he was not making any money from quote unquote pimping or getting these women across, or men getting them across state lines. None of that was being done. This was all being done for entertainment purposes.
To be real. When someone walks out earlier than expected, the public rushes to assign meaning: victory, failure, corruption, mercy. But those words are too emotional for institutions. Institutions don't operate on emotion, they operate on calculation. Calculations shift when risk shifts. Risk can mean exposure, risk can mean precedent, risk can mean instability. Sometimes it means all three at once. And when risk outweighs benefit, containment stops making sense. That's when exits appear. The public sees release as an endpoint. Inside, it's viewed as damage control. not because of innocence or guilt, but because of trajectory. Where is this situation headed if it continues? What does it attract? Who does it implicate? How much attention does it sustain? Attention is expensive. Sustained attention is dangerous. Closed systems survive by outlasting interest. They rely on fatigue, on distraction, on the public moving on. But when a situation refuses to cool down.
So it's an interesting argument. I don't think this judge buys it. It might be interesting on an appeal, but I don't think the judge is going to give him a judgment of acquittal on those 2 counts based on the argument. Now, the more interesting argument to me, and it's their last argument for new trial, is that, listen, if you were just going to charge him with these 2 counts, which I originally said when I looked at all the evidence, and don't forget, I was getting calls during this trial from individuals that were telling me, hey, I have information that exonerates what they're saying against Sean Combs, essentially saying that Cassie and others were participating more than just having sex in a room. They were participating more than that. They were paying people, they were hiring people, they were sending me pictures even when Diddy wasn't around. They were asking me to come over even when Diddy wasn't around. These were what these witnesses were telling me, which is really Brady evidence. And I don't know if that was ever turned over. But the more interesting argument is that all these counts were charged. The only thing he was convicted of were the Mann Acts, and he probably wouldn't have been convicted of these Mann Acts but for all this other stuff that came in to try and prove these counts that they could not prove and did not have a basis for bringing.
Let me just challenge you on that, because this is a jury who didn't find that there was sex trafficking. And I can't confirm that they found him guilty of the Mann Act because of the hotel video or anything else. I mean, it seems to me that they might have convicted him on that based on the travel records, the payment receipts, all about that. Not even necessarily allegations of violence. I mean, do you think that it was because of, let's say, the Intercontinental Hotel video that he was convicted of transportation to engage in prostitution? It always felt to me that they proved that charge based purely on, the documents.
Well, I always feel like during a trial, whenever you get a guilty verdict on one of the counts or 2 of the counts out of 6 or 7, you think to yourself, is it because of these other things that they brought up? How bad he is, he's not a good guy, the video came out. Sometimes juries will split the baby, meaning, there's people that want to convict, there's people that don't want to convict, and they're like, okay, let's convict him on these acts. We can all agree we can convict him on these acts. He's not a good guy. He transported these men across state lines. Let's convict him on this. There's always going to be a question of that. The only way to not have a question of that, obviously, is when the jury comes out, someone gives an interview and says, hey, this is why we did it, is because, this tape was so bad and these other incidents were so bad that we were like, we can't just let him walk with nothing. So we convicted him on the Mann Acts. Now, we don't have a juror saying that. Do I think eventually jurors are going to start coming out? Yeah, I think so. I think some of these jurors are going to come out. They're going to want to do some interviews, not before sentencing. And I think after sentencing, I think some of them will come out and we'll discuss it, because I think that was the feeling I was getting from this jury and the reactions they had to Comey's closing, and even the reaction just in general to the 5 or the 6 U.S. attorney team. I think their reactions in general were very noticeable, and I think that this is a jury that wants to talk to people once I think he gets sentenced.
Okay, so now let's move on to the pardon discussion. So if he can't get relief from the court in getting the conviction thrown out or a new trial, can he get relief through a pardon? Before we talk about, is this a real thing, what is the process to even obtain a federal pardon? How do you even go about that?
Sure. So it's a pardon or a commutation. If someone is actually in custody, they could also get a commutation, which does not wipe the crime off your record. It just allows you to get out of jail. So he has that option to give him a commutation. If he gets sentenced, he can also give him a commutation. But as for the process, there's an application on the DOJ website, and I'm part of.
When it keeps mutating into new angles, new allegations, new implications, the cost of holding someone inside can outweigh the cost of letting them out. That's not justice, that's logistics. Behind bars, everything is measured: time, visibility, impact. If someone's presence inside generates more noise than their absence would, the equation flips. Quiet becomes the priority. Quiet doesn't always mean confinement. Sometimes quiet means release. That's the part people struggle to accept. that leaving doesn't automatically mean winning. It means the system believes the storm is better managed outside than inside. Inside creates friction, outside disperses it. Once released, the narrative fragments, responsibility diffuses, oversight loosens, the spotlight widens until it loses focus. That's not accidental. That's how attention is diluted. Dilution is safer than confrontation. The lead up to release is rarely dramatic. No speeches, no explanations, just procedural steps, signatures, movement.
Of some charities that also do a lot of pro bono work for pardons and commutations. You can fill out this form, a website. It essentially lists, the reasons why you should get a pardon, what kind of community service you've done, things of that nature. There's a separate application for commutation, but you can file a pardon application, and you could also say, hey, listen, if it's not a pardon, I'm looking for a commutation. You attach your indictment. You would reasons why you feel your crime was you were unfairly prejudiced or unfairly convicted. All of those things go into the packet. I always try to help people that are filling it out on their own to show them, what to point out. Those type of cases are always heartening, because those people deserve pardons. They deserve commutations if they're in, and it's some sort of crazy drug offense that was brought up in the 90s. All of those things are reasons for pardons and commutations.
So is this real? I mean, here's the thing. He is in a much better position to get a pardon or a commutation of his sentence because he wasn't convicted of sex trafficking and racketeering. There is a way to justify this based on some of the arguments I just mentioned that his defense team is making, that maybe he shouldn't have been brought up on this. The I-Man Act, not as serious as what he's facing. Is this real? Do you think that this is going to happen? That he's going to get a pardon or a commutation from President Trump?
I don't know if he's going to get one. I do think that it's real because, like I said before, President Trump, whether they like him, don't like him, if he feels something is wrong, and we've seen this happen before in the past, if he feels something is wrong, someone got railroaded, someone was convicted, wrongfully, he will take a look at that. Yeah, Sean Combs has said things in the past that probably were not great. I've read them, but I think that if anyone understands that, look at President Trump's cabinet. There's individuals on his cabinet. His vice president has said things in the past that weren't great for him. But he understands that people evolve, people change their minds. People understand that there's certain requirements, things that are going on, certain pressures that they're under. And I don't think that would affect whether or not he would grant a pardon or commutation based on things that were said in the past. I think it would be based on what he gets sentenced to, or based on the facts of the Mann Act, that the Mann Act itself, I think, is unconstitutional. I think there's issues the way that it was applied in this case.
But from an optics point of view, moral point of view, what about everything that came out of trial? The texts, the bruises, the Intercontinental tape. It's not like you can say Diddy is totally clean, that he's a complete angel. Yes, he was acquitted of the most serious charges, but the evidence that came out during the course of the trial, wouldn't it be difficult for the president to justify maybe pardoning Diddy? Maybe it is a commutation. Maybe it is, if he gets 5 years, he says, okay, I'm commuting it down to 2 or 2.5. I don't know how it would work, but that's the part that I think people might be struggling with, and what you heard, I think, from Megyn Kelly.
And even his own lawyers, no one was coming out here saying that Sean Combs is an angel, that Sean Combs doesn't do anything that is off the wall, crazy. These things, no one is claiming that. And in fact, even during my interviews, when I was saying things that weren't so popular, saying like, listen, he's only going to get convicted of these Mann Acts, I don't think he's going to get convicted of anything. And people were attacking me and saying like, oh, you like, abusers. That's not the point here. The point is to look at the law, apply the law fairly, apply the facts to the law. That's what's important here. And that's what I was doing when I was looking at the case. Looking at this from that standpoint, he's going to have been in for about 15 or 16 months by the time he gets sentenced. It's not like he got a freebie. If he got a misdemeanor battery, he would have served 364 days in jail. If he got a couple charges, maybe he would have served 2 years in jail. If this judge...
A transfer that doesn't announce itself until it's already done. By the time the public hears, it's over. And that timing matters. Because reaction is strongest before reality settles. Afterward, outrage competes with exhaustion. People argue about fairness while already half moving on. That's how momentum dies. Momentum is what institutions fear most. The walls don't just hold people, they hold narratives. When someone exits, the narrative escapes too. It becomes harder to control, but also harder to pin down. Truth scatters, responsibility blurs. That ambiguity is useful. The days leading up to release are often marked by subtle shifts, less visibility, more isolation, fewer updates. These aren't signals of mercy, they're signals of preparation, of smoothing the path, of making the transition feel inevitable rather than sudden. Nothing about it is spontaneous. Once outside, the environment changes instantly.
But that is a hallmark of any serious romantic relationship, and that is what these were: serious, long-term romantic relationships. By the way, not surprising they're really focusing on this because, again, he was acquitted of sex trafficking. They highlight how the jury didn't find sex trafficking of Jane or Cassie, that it didn't occur. There was no force, fraud, or coercion that was used to induce these women to engage in commercial sex acts. For transportation to engage in prostitution, what he was convicted of, the prosecution didn't have to prove that violence was used or that fraud was used or threats were used. It was just, did you transport these women and men for the purposes of sex work, commercial sex acts? And obviously the jury convicted him of that. And they highlight all the jury found was that there was prostitution, payment of porn stars and escorts. And they highlight that he is a swinger, or under the Mann Act, a John. And they argue he doesn't deserve to be locked up for this. Quote, Sean Combs should not be in jail for this conduct. In fact, he may be the only person currently in a United States jail for being any sort of John, and certainly the only person in jail for hiring adult male escorts for him and his girlfriend when he did not even have sex with the escort himself. Over the last 75 years, the White Slave Traffic Act has been limited to defendants who cause interstate travel for financial gain through the business of prostitution. That Sean Combs remains in jail for being convicted of being a customer of consensual adult sex services makes this case truly exceptional. Not only is prosecuting the users of adult prostitution services inconsistent with the Mann Act, it's inconsistent with the prosecution policies of the district attorneys of Manhattan and the city attorney of Los Angeles, California, two of the three locations where this prostitution allegedly took place. In addition, Mr. Combs is incarcerated while everyone else involved in this identical conduct, his girlfriends, the cowboys, the agency leaders, the porn stars, and others, walk free, as they should. If there was ever a fact pattern that was exceptional under the Mann Act, it is this one. And then they move on to another argument, that the Department of Justice, the DOJ, has usually only charged Mann Act violations when there's financial gain. And they even cite a number of cases in the Southern District of New York, where Combs was prosecuted, that apparently involved defendants that set up a prostitution business for profit. Again, trying to distinguish between Combs' conduct and these cases. He never did any of this for profit, they argued. And they even cite the 1953 U.S. Attorney's Manual that says, quote, as a general rule, prosecution should not be instituted in the so-called non-commercial cases. And they claim the Department of Justice manual today, quote, makes clear that the prosecution of customers involved in an 18 U.S.C. 2421 offense, like Mr. Combs here, is now limited to prosecuting those who engage in commercial sex with victims of sex trafficking, in addition to those who otherwise perpetrate or facilitate human trafficking offenses. And in the absence of any sex trafficking charge, however, it is clear that the standalone Mann Act counts never would have been prosecuted. That seems true. I think you ask any legal expert, they will say if all the government had against Sean Combs was the transportation to engage in prostitution charges, just the prostitution charges, they probably wouldn't have gone after him. They coupled it with racketeering and they coupled it with sex trafficking. I agree with that. I don't think that they would have gone after him just for that.
Silence becomes optional. Movement becomes unrestricted, but the weight doesn't lift, it transfers. Pressure doesn't disappear, it relocates. Freedom doesn't erase scrutiny, it transforms it. Instead of constant surveillance, there's constant speculation. Instead of guards, there are cameras. Instead of schedules, there are expectations. And expectations are brutal. People assume release means relief, but release often means exposure. Inside, everything is contained. Outside, everything is interpreted. Every move is analyzed. Every silence is questioned, every statement is twisted. There's no handbook for navigating that shift. The system knows this. That's why release is often framed as an end when it's really a repositioning. The story isn't closed, it's just moved to a different stage. A stage with more exits and fewer rules. That's where accountability becomes slippery, because once someone is out, responsibility is easier to argue about than enforce. Jurisdiction fragments, authority overlaps, blame circulates without settling.
Anyway, the defense highlights how modern-day prosecutions of Johns is really when you're talking about exploiting vulnerable foreigners who don't speak English well, which again is not the case here. And they highlight how the only potentially comparable case in New York is where you had a retired police officer and a former judge who apparently hired women to have sex with a male fraternal group called the Jesters. But Combs' attorneys say, while there was no profit there, there's no profit here, there was sex trafficking of those prostitutes. That's what's different. Again, Combs was acquitted of sex trafficking in this case. And here's the main point, quote, moreover, the cases which involve defendants similarly situated to Mr. Combs have been released on bond pending sentencing. In reviewing the cases across the country where the primary or sole conviction was for a violation of 18 U.S.C. 2421, the defendants who were not charged with running a prostitution business have been released pending sentencing. And then Combs' attorneys make another argument for why Combs' conditions are exceptional. And it's about him being locked up at the MDC. They say that a district court judge in the Southern District in another case basically said how bad the MDC is. As Judge Furman noted, the state of affairs at MDC is unacceptable. In so noting, Judge Furman concluded that the conditions in the MDC qualify as exceptional reasons under the statute justifying, and this was the defendant in this case, Chavez's continuing release. Judge Furman found that the conditions at the MDC are, quote, dreadful in many respects, but three warrant particular emphasis. 1. Continued reports of inordinate periods of lockdown. 2. Claims that the facility provides inadequate and or substantially delayed necessary medical care, a particular risk in this case. And 3. General issues about the conditions at the facility. These conditions have not abated in Mr. Combs' detention at the facility. As the court is aware, during Mr. Combs' incarceration at the MDC, the facility was subject to an interagency sweep that was designed to achieve our shared goal of maintaining a safe environment for both our employees and the incarcerated individuals housed at MDC Brooklyn. They're actually quoting what the rationale was. In other words, there is a significant issue at the MDC related to the safety of employees and incarcerated individuals that require outside law enforcement action from multiple agencies to address. Importantly, MDC, as a jail, has a significant law enforcement presence within its walls 24 hours per day that are equipped with investigatory and often unregulated authority. Thus, the requirement of outside law enforcement agencies to ensure safety within the MDC is an admission that serious violence, mayhem, and chaos is occurring within the MDC that requires more than a Band-Aid raid, but rather surgery. Indeed, we are aware of ongoing threats of violence and actual violence in the facility such that Mr. Combs' safety is constantly at risk. And they go on to argue, though Mr. Combs has been a model inmate for his nearly year-long period of confinement, the violent conditions are still very much a concern for Mr. Combs and is an unnecessary confinement risk given the clear precedent of multiple similarly situated Mann Act convictions where defendants were released on conditions. Now, the government, by the way, would probably disagree with that statement of him being a model inmate. Remember when they accused Combs of trying to arrange three-way phone calls and buying the use of other inmates' phone privileges to try to make sure the government wasn't listening in, that he was having these private conversations, that he was allegedly trying to contact witnesses in the case, that he allegedly orchestrated a birthday campaign to help his public image while he was locked up. So if we hear a government response, I'm sure they're going to say something about that. Then, the defense highlights he's not a risk.
Circulation is safer than conclusion. The public wants a verdict, a clean arc, a beginning, middle, and end. But real systems don't provide closure, they provide transitions. They move problems from one container to another. That's what this feels like. Not resolution, reassignment. People ask whether this proves something was wrong all along or whether it confirms something worked. But those questions assume a moral framework that institutions don't use. Institutions use outcome-based logic: what reduces exposure, what stabilizes operations, what lowers risk. If release achieves that, release becomes acceptable. That doesn't mean truth was found, it means equilibrium was restored. The reaction afterward follows a familiar pattern: shock, outrage, defense, fatigue. People line up on predictable sides, arguments repeat, new information is promised but rarely delivered, the cycle burns hot, then cools. Cooling is the goal. Meanwhile, the person at the center adjusts to a world that feels both freer and more hostile. Inside, rules were rigid but clear. Outside, everything is ambiguous, support is conditional, loyalty is tested, silence is scrutinized. There's no safe move. Every statement risks reopening doors someone worked hard to close. Every refusal to speak fuels suspicion. Every appearance creates another angle. That's why silence often follows release. Silence isn't peace, it's strategy. Silence buys time. Time lets narratives compete until none dominate. Time allows interest to decay. Time gives institutions distance. Distance is protection. The idea that release equals vindication is comforting, but inaccurate. Vindication requires clarity. This situation offers none. It offers absence. Absence of confinement. Absence of explanation. Absence of accountability. Absence leaves room for interpretation. This isn't the end of the story. It's the point where the story becomes harder to track, where facts dissolve into narratives, where accountability becomes abstract. That's often by design. The release isn't a statement of truth, it's a maneuver, a repositioning in a larger game of perception, risk, and control. Games don't end when someone leaves the board, they continue with fewer visible pieces. What happens next won't be announced with headlines. It will unfold quietly, through decisions made off camera, through conversations that never reach the public, through consequences that only make sense later. That's how these situations actually conclude. Not with answers, but with distance. And distance, more than walls, is what keeps the truth just out of reach.